Well, welcome everyone. I am Ashira Ostrow. I'm a professor of law at the Maurice A. Dean School of Law at Hofstra University, and I am the executive director of the Breslin Center for Real Estate Studies. And I'm really delighted to welcome you all today to our program on trends in Long Island real estate. So obviously the world has been, kind of dramatically transformed over the past few months and, even more over the past just couple of weeks. And we know that these changes will have very profound social, political, and economic consequences, even if we don't really know yet what those consequences will look like. And we certainly can't predict the future, but we are very fortunate to have with us today a group of highly accomplished commercial real estate professionals. And they're joining us to share their thoughts on how some of these changes might play out in commercial real estate and focusing on Long Island. So I want to take the opportunity to really thank each of our guests for joining us today, making time in their very busy schedules to be here with us. And I want to give a very special thank you to Scott Berman, who took a lead in organizing this panel and helped me throughout the process. So before we get started, I want to take a minute to explain the format that we'll be using. Each of our panelists will spend a couple of minutes introducing themselves, telling you a little bit about their businesses and their experience transitioning through this the last few months. And then we're going to open it up to a more general discussion among all of the panelists. And so I'll ask them some questions, and I also really encourage you to submit your questions throughout the program using the chat function. And then I'll do my best to incorporate your questions into the discussion as we go forward. So again, you can submit questions through the, through the chat function. Okay, at this time, I would like to introduce our first panelist. And that is Scott Berman. Scott has been a principal at Engel Berman since 2001, and he is actively involved in directing Engel Berman's overall investments and operations. And in addition, since 2012, Scott has also served as the president of Engel Berman Construction. And in that role, he designed and implemented a corporate restructuring that allowed the company to triple its business volume and also advance operations into a variety of new business sectors. Scott manages a team of more than 100 employees, and Scott and his team are responsible for an aggregate construction volume in excess of $1 billion at any given time. And so it's my pleasure now to turn the panel over to Scott.
Thank you, Professor Ostrow. Thank you for that very warm welcome. And it's been a pleasure working with you in putting this panel together. As you mentioned, my company is Engel Berman. We've been around since the late 90s, and we're builders and developers headquartered here on Long Island. We have a regional scope. We have properties across Long Island, Westchester, Manhattan, and New Jersey, and a quite diverse portfolio, which I'll tell you about. But however, we specialize in sort of a full spectrum of senior living products. So 55 and older housing, independent living, assisted living, and memory care products. We also specialize in these sort of need-driven and care-based real estate products and operating businesses, and I'll tell you about some of those as well. We're split up into 4 divisions. We have a development arm, a construction arm, which, as you mentioned, is my day-to-day, managing our construction division, a property management arm that manages our senior living assets and our rental assets, and we have a consumer-facing brand we call EB Living. So we develop, build, own, and operate various property types. In the commercial sector, we own a bunch of office and industrial properties. However, that's not really one of our main focuses. Those are sort of what I consider to be legacy properties, properties that we've owned for quite some time. We do play a bit in the retail sector, and primarily because the site selection criteria for senior living is quite similar to retail. So oftentimes we'll find a property that we intend to do a senior development, and we'll shift gears. And over the years, we've done deals with Stop and Shop and Lowe's Home Improvement, and Lifetime Fitness, and a bunch of banks and restaurants. So we've been active in the retail space. And again, in senior living, we do independent living, assisted living, and memory care. Our assisted living brand is the Bristol. It's a high-end private pay model of assisted living. our independent living brand we call Encore Luxury Living. And we have 23 operating senior living properties across New York and New Jersey. We take care of 5,000 elderly residents, and we have about 2,800 employees in that business. On the residential side of things, we've constructed about 5,000 units over the past 20 years, primarily 55 plus gated lifestyle communities with sort of a country club element, large clubhouse and the like. And we typically brand those seasons. And more recently, we forayed into the rental property arena. We currently have 800 units in construction, rental units that is, and two different product types. One we call Sutton Landing, which is geared towards seniors, and the other we've named Bricks, which is geared towards young professionals. And we have a lot of high hopes that that's a brand that we're going to grow across Long Island because it is sorely needed. We've also entered into the drug, alcohol, and addiction research and treatment space very recently with a project we call Wellbridge. It's a really unique approach to addiction treatment and research. It was a project that was 8 years in the making. We are in partnership with Northwell Health. It's the first time that addiction research and treatment have been coupled on one campus in partnership with a major healthcare institution. And we're open for business and seeing patients as of this week, which is a very exciting time for us. I personally grew up here in Long Island. I went to NYU Stern in the city, lived in Manhattan for a bunch of years, and moved back to Long Island to start a family. I've got 3 kids, 6, 11, and 13. And I've been a competitive endurance athlete for the better part of 20 years. So if I'm not working or spending time with my family, you can catch me swimming, biking, or running. I've been a partner at Berman since 2001. I spent the first 12 years of my career in development. So acquisitions, financing, land use, government relations, project planning, a little bit of marketing, kind of everything leading up to construction. And while I remain actively involved in the overall operations of Berman, as you mentioned in your intro, the last 8 years, I've been primarily running our construction division. So I have 100 employees that I oversee, and we manage about $1 billion in construction at any given time. So our current construction activity, we just finished up a Bristol assisted living in Somerset, New Jersey. We're starting a Quick Check on the same campus, and we had planned a hotel also on the same campus right behind that. Post-COVID, we'll see how that shakes out. In New York City, we have 2 large projects going on the Upper West Side at 305 West End Avenue. We bought an asset about 2 years ago that was an operating senior living property, and we're finishing up a $40 million renovation that should be complete in the near future. And on York and 86th, we are building a 14-story memory care facility, which is sorely needed in Manhattan, and we are currently pouring the 5th floor of concrete. In White Plains, we are finishing up the last of a portfolio-wide renovation program. And then here in Long Island, we have 3 active projects. In Uniondale, we're building 400 units of residential. Mount Sinai, 220 units, plus a Bristol assisted living. And in Deer Park, another 200 rental units as well. And just to give you a quick peek of what's coming for us in the next 6 to 9 months, we're doing a condo project in Dix Hills, 80 units. We're beginning sales in about 2 weeks. In Long Beach, we are in contract to purchase a property known as the Superblock. It's a 6-acre vacant piece of property on the Atlantic Ocean. We're going to build a 2-story parking podium, and above that, 2 100-unit condo buildings and 1 238-unit rental building. Super exciting project for us, and we expect to be in the ground in and around the end of the year. In Bethpage, we have another Bristol assisted living slide for this year. And after many years of careful consideration, we made the decision to expand our business to Southeast Florida. So we have contracts on properties in Boca and Miami. Boca will be a mixed-use project. Miami will be a senior living project. And we are working hard on a couple of things in the Fort Lauderdale market as well. So I'm really happy to be here, and I am looking forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much, Scott, and thank you for filling us in on all of the exciting projects that you're working on. It is now my pleasure to introduce our second guest, Frank Pucinelli. And Frank is the Chief Operating Officer for the Commercial and Logistics Business Segment at RXR Realty. As COO, Frank is responsible for all business planning, budgeting, and operational activities, and he oversees marketing, leasing, and property management. He's also responsible for the physical due diligence and underwriting for acquisitions, capital improvement plans, asset repositioning strategies, and various design ideas. And as well, he's responsible for all tenant improvement and capital construction projects. And so we're very much looking forward to hearing a little bit about what is going on at RXR, and I'm happy to turn it over to Frank.
Thank you, Professor. I appreciate that. And it's a real pleasure to participate in this webinar. I think throughout this crisis, it's been great to always talk with our peers and others in the industry and get feedback. It's a challenging time for all of us, so I welcome the opportunity to do that. A little bit of company background. RXR is a vertically integrated owner and operator of real estate with a portfolio of assets concentrated around the New York metro region. We were founded in 2007 with our senior management company formerly running Rex & Associates, which was a publicly traded REIT that we sold in 2006 and then formed RXR as soon as that transaction culminated. Like Scott's company, we have multiple business divisions, including property management, design and construction, and investment management. We have about 75 properties in the tri-state region with about $21 billion in gross asset value under management, which is about 26 million square feet. We have about 6,100 multifamily units in our portfolio, and the RXR portfolio continues to maintain very high occupancy on Long Island with our Woodbury portfolio at about 92%, and what we call our prime portfolio in Uniondale and concentrated around Melville and Western Suffolk, occupied about 95%. Personally, about myself, I was also born and raised on Long Island. I'm married to my wife, Margaret. We have 3 children, ages 14 through 11. I'm a registered architect in the state of New York, and I did my MBA with a concentration in finance at Fordham University. As Chief Operating Officer of our commercial division, I lead a team of over 400 individuals, and I've been with the company for about 21 years, where I started out in our construction and architecture division as a project manager. The current state of our company, we have multiple projects in development. We're the master developer for New Rochelle. We have projects underway there, as well at the LIU campus. And our Glen Isle project on the North Shore of Long Island is obviously in development and going very well. And we, of course, have the hub development here by the Nassau Coliseum, which we're very excited about. RXR is well positioned to succeed in this current environment. I think that one of the things that we're always focused on is being a change agent in the markets that we work in. And prior to the COVID pandemic, RXR was focused on what we call our RXO 2.0 initiative, which is centered on development of amenities in our portfolio with the needs of the workforce top of mind, and with a focus on technology. We've been very focused on how the new generation of office workers, certainly prior to the pandemic, we considered them, instead of being the 9-to-5 worker, being the 5-to-9 worker. And with that willingness to work harder came the desire for those folks to have more amenitized buildings and properties and have some of the comforts that they have at their home when they are working in our office buildings. And so we had stood up a digital lab to develop solutions in partnerships with the likes of McKinsey and Microsoft to work on those initiatives and help bring technology to bear in solving some of those problems. And I think that work allowed us to quickly pivot as we entered this development of the pandemic to now apply some of those solutions to making the workplace safer for all the occupants as we prepared for the return to work. So a tremendous amount of work has been done to get us to today, which coincidentally is phase 2 for Long Island, which is includes, among other things, the reofficing of our buildings. So we're very excited about that. As far as the future, again, we're very happy to see people starting to get back to work and to be partnering with our tenants to do that in as safe a manner as possible. I think it's very important for people to come back to work and collaborate, particularly for the younger people who are graduating and looking for jobs and entering the workforce. So critical to be in a position where they can take advantage of mentoring opportunities, and that's a lot harder to do with a digital platform, and I know we'll talk more about that later. But as far as the future goes, we're obviously continued on focusing on the development and delivering of these services and products designed to enhance the experiences of our customers and to optimize the value of our real estate. We're focused on innovative community building and transformative projects in the regions that we do work, with an intense focus on making the communities that we work and live in as good as possible for the people in those areas. And obviously now under the current pandemic, where we have a super focus on safety and transparency in the near term with our tenants, our stakeholders, the communities that we work in, and with the community at large.
Thank you, Frank, very, very much. And we're going to turn over now to Whitney Arcaro, who is one of your colleagues at RXR Realty. Whitney is the head of marketing and retail leasing at RXR Realty. And Whitney is responsible for overseeing the marketing and communications of RXR Realty's 25.6 million square feet of commercial assets in Manhattan and the surrounding region. And she's also responsible for marketing and strategic branding initiatives for RXR's more than 6,000 multifamily units and more than 1 million square feet of retail space. So I'm thrilled to turn it over to Whitney.
Thank you so much, Professor. And I echo the other speakers' thanks and appreciation for you arranging this and having us part of what I hope will be a very productive and collaborative dialogue after we're finished our intros. And I also want to give a very special thanks to one of my favorite colleagues, Frank, for his fantastic comprehensive introduction, because it makes my moment right now a lot easier to have to go through some of those compelling and very amazing stats when you realize how quickly RXR has grown since its start in 2007. So while a very esteemed and established management team that founded it, the reality is the company was founded about 12 years ago, and to have that incredible growth arc and still have so much growth and pipeline ongoing really just sets the tone for the pace at which we run and the cross-functional skill sets of all the executive team and general team that supports it. So I think what I'll do is, since Frank gave a great introduction, and also we know from comments before, you're seeing some similarities in some of the real estate investment thesis based on the companies that are represented today. So knowing that you also have an audience full of those who are both part of the scholastic community, as well as the legal community, as well as the real estate community, I think I'll spend a little bit of time just on my arc through my professional growth in real estate, to kind of give an interesting tidbit that brings it full circle. Joanne Minieri, who is also one of our esteemed executives at RXR, and obviously a name very familiar to the Hofstra community, was being recognized at a women's forum, and she was given one of the marquee awards. And I remember when she accepted the award, she said something that was very interesting, that many people who come into real estate and eventually reach a certain level of success in real estate didn't necessarily start in real estate or start in what we'll call traditional real estate affiliated field. And I definitely represent one of those people. I started in the entertainment industry working for Warner Music Group. I am a big believer in following relationships and following people that have been good to me, and I feel that I've done right by them, which candidly is not an uncommon theme when we think of how a lot of great successful real estate projects come together. There's a lot of loyalty and support of the good people behind it, more so than just, is this a deal that makes sense? So and through that, a mentor of mine then somehow helped me transition into private equity and investment banking. That then led to an amazing opportunity, which really made me fall in love with retail, which was working on, at the time, this is, I'm also dating myself, just after Y2K, but it was working on a large data-driven CRM, very new and cutting edge technology in the CRM solutions business that essentially was aggregating basically the top 20 retailers coming together in a general consumer earn and burn program, as well as airlines and travel rewards, candidly to compete with the overall cannibalization of customer that was driven by Walmart. So it's funny that, 20 plus years later, you see that, certain big box and certain strong performers are still those strong performers. So it really shows you that operationally, those were companies that continue to adjust to the movement of the times, the shifts in consumer behavior, and continue to outperform and do well. So through that, part of my job during that time with that company was to also work on call center development and secure office space in 4 locations. And that's how I ended up transitioning into real estate brokerage, which then led me working on a multinational account, led me to meeting the executive team at Vornado Realty Trust. So in a very short period of time, I went from the music business to real estate, but I really defined Vornado as my formative years in my real estate education. So it gave me the exposure to work on, at the time, a national portfolio. It had over 100 million square feet. I touched on everything from commercial office space in New York City predominantly, but also Washington, D.C., Chicago, and San Francisco. I worked on retail on a national portfolio level, as well as a significant street retail portfolio in New York City. Had a chance to also support investor relations in various functions. Sustainability obviously became a very important factor in how commercial and residential properties run. So working on the growth of the overall sustainability program and the successful communications of that. And then that transitioned into a final project I worked on right before I left, which was the pre-development aspects of 220 Central Park South. Notably right now, I think still the most expensive residential building on in the Western Hemisphere. So through that, I then transitioned into ultra luxury residential development, working with the Schvo Group, which also entailed ultra luxury hospitality. I had a chance to work on capital raising, EB5 financing. I was traveling all over the world at that point on various capital needs, as well as calling outstanding architectural support, working with people like Renzo Piano, RDAI, among others. And through that, it then gave me the ability to connect with Scott Reckler. And I really would like to say the rest is history, because I have enjoyed and loved being with RXR so much in my 3 years there thus far. It's a family-driven culture. The people are incredibly hardworking, incredibly prescient, forward-thinking, all very much driven through the vision at the top. And what's so exciting, and Frank obviously spoke to this in his introduction, and we will go into this more during the collaboration session after our intros, we really are looking at real estate quite differently. We're really looking at it now as a service and technology driven solution, a customer focus goal within our investment thesis that marries not only what we'll call strategic locations, but strategic locations that really come to life and build mutual value when you really think of the customer's positions and wants first. And through that, where I think the collectively certain communities, mostly gateway communities in particular, are really, if they embrace that approach, I think they're really poised for some exceptionally interesting, unique growth and value creation in our real estate climate, probably for the next decade or 2 decades thereafter. So thank you.
Whitney, thank you so much for that and for sharing a little bit of your journey, which I do think is very helpful and just encouraging for some of my students and some other alums who might be interested in real estate. And it is my pleasure now to turn the panel over to David Wolkoff. David is a principal at Heartland Business Center, which is a privately owned real estate company in the New York tri-state area. David oversees the acquisition, financing, management, and development of major real estate projects. And right now he's focused on 5 Points Towers, which is a 1.3 million square foot development consisting of 2 40-plus story towers in Long Island City, Queens, as well as the development of Heartland Town Square, which is a 450-acre smart growth community that he's developing here in Suffolk County. So David, please join us.
Thank you, Ashira. So we're a privately owned family, and thank you for everything, putting it together, Scott, and thank you all for joining. We're a privately owned company. We own and manage over 10 million square feet of industrial properties. Like you said, we're finishing up on 1,122 unit building in Long Island City called 5 Points Towers. And that should be open around September of this year, maybe a little sooner, and depending on what's happening in the marketplace. And from there, we're going to jump right into Heartland Town Square, a 450-acre smart growth community, live, work, and play community, which Long Island, we believe, and some others, desperately need. I think a lot, especially in this time. We think it's an opportune time. About myself, I'm married to Stephanie, and I have 3 children. My oldest is 18, Zachary. My middle is Tyler, he's 16, and my daughter, Lexi, is 13. We have been okay during this time. Heartland, 5 Points, it was considered an essential property, so we never stopped. We kept on building, and the office kept on, was open, and we kept moving with our projects. We just finished a 230,000 square foot building, which was leased. What we're seeing right now here in Long Island, especially with our industrial properties, is that last mile, an Amazon kind of thing where you got to get the product to the individual consumer as soon as possible. So our properties right now are about 99% leased. We continue to build. We're going to build another 150,000 square foot building next year, as well as dive right into Heartland Town Square. It's a very quick introduction, so we can get on to the conference.
Well, thank you for that. Still very helpful introduction. And yes, I'm delighted to actually start a conversation amongst all the panelists. I think great if we can just unmute all of the panelists. Fantastic. And so we've had some time over the past couple of weeks to kind of talk about what we see as the, most current issues and in real estate, and that you guys see coming down the pike. And I just wanted to start, just to go back a step and talk a little bit about, we all transitioned to working from home kind of overnight. I certainly did, the university did, and I know all of you did as well. How do you think that this working from home situation has affected your industry sector, whether it's construction, retail, office, whatever your specialty is, and your business outlook? And so I'm happy to open it up to whomever wants to start. Scott, I can go to you if you
Sure. Yeah, I'll jump in and maybe just talk a bit about that transition to work from home, and then maybe we can dive into our individual sectors thereafter. But for us, it was kind of a quick wartime agenda, right? I manage a team of 100, so transitioning to a work from home in a business that really is very sort of collaborative and communicative, it's hard to replicate with technology. So in all frankness, there was this initial sort of freak out phase, and we wanted to figure out how are we going to make this work? How are we going to manage remotely? How are we going to come up with a routine and schedule that works? And the premise really was to over communicate virtually and then kind of dial back as that was practicable. So we put together an intensive schedule of weekly Zoom calls, project-based, management team-based, executive teams, partners and executive boards, and then also a lot of sort of outreach at the ground level. Project managers, supers, estimators, engineers. And in the midst of this also, we were talking about a software migration to a communication platform pre-COVID. We were looking at Slack and Teams and a couple of others, and quickly decided to pivot and move to Teams, created a little internal task force and hired a consultant very quickly and got Teams up and running. And that was a tremendous help for us also to get off email and really communicate in a much more collaborative way. We had an issue with document signing. I literally signed hundreds of checks each week. So how do we do that virtually? So we came up with a mix of DocuSign and Adobe Sign and a couple of other ways to make that all happen remotely. And then one of the best things that we did that I think I'll keep going after is I implemented a company-wide biweekly webinar. I would address the whole company, communicate a message of real, solidarity, unity, educate the team, people who might not be privy to this type of information about what's going on with ED globally, talk about project status, industry responses, and kind of give my assessment of what's going on. We also would send out surveys pre-webinar so people had an opportunity to ask questions and give feedback, and really was a great thing to kind of build camaraderie and build team. And we fell into a groove that works, but frankly, I'm excited now that we're really getting to a reopening phase because in hindsight, it's not quite as effective as a real work environment was for us.
And I would
That's-
echo what Scott's saying about, how everybody had to really quickly figure out how to get nimble. And we came up with the solutions, again, quickly implementing Teams and working on Zoom calls. And we formulated a task force that meets every day at 9 a.m. with senior leadership and other key members of the company to make sure that we stay focused on not only what we needed to deal with day in and day out as we had before the full shutdown, people getting sick in the buildings and having to deal with that. But then once we did retract, also starting to think very early on about understanding that we will come back and what does that look like and how are we going to move towards that. And our CEO, Scott Reckler's always very creative about creating a kind of a mantra and a theme to move forward. So very early on, we created what we called the March to Memorial Day, which was a very deliberate focus on picking a date, even though we didn't know when the state would let us come back in certain regions, to say by Memorial Day, we need to have a plan in place to bring everybody back in a safe manner, whether it's on our construction or development projects or in our office buildings. And focusing on that very early, some 97 days ago now, we were able to put ourselves in a position where when the state did give us dates to do that, we were able to kind of open the spigot and start to ramp up very quickly. And we feel like we're in as good a place as we can be now because of that. But that communication day in and day out has been super critical.
Yeah, and if I could just interject and ask, well, now that you've done it and you've been doing it for a while, how have you found that the industry has responded to this working from home in terms of, real estate trends, property values, things like that?
Sure. So from my perspective, in terms of real estate trends, it's been, there's a tremendous amount of work that just goes into, keeping the lights on, so to speak, especially in the commercial office buildings when the tenants aren't in there. And that has to happen. It's very difficult to, showings basically stopped overnight, and Whitney can opine on that as well from the standpoint of trying to lease space. But you pivot to virtual tours. And you're ready to do that. And as a landlord, we did that. We did some transactions, but you also had the effect of companies themselves, our clients, trying to figure out what the world was going to look like for them long term, right? And so a lot of tenants who were in the market and potentially considering a move initially backed off from that. And there's still a lot of them who have a kind of a wait and see approach to what they may do next in terms of the expansion of our business or new business.
Yeah. And I think also, it's interesting because I think all of the panelists here bring exposure and had interest in various asset classes, even if there's a predominant focus on one. And I think, what happened essentially in beginning of March through beginning of April, there was such a tremendous focus on how do you clear out density in commercial centers. And then at the same time, how do you prepare your residential hubs to accommodate every single person being back at the building at the same time 24/7. And I think, us having the perspective, having both of those asset classes, not only within the portfolio, but within connected context, one informs the other. So then when you start to pick up on, we proactively leaned in, continued routine surveys and questionnaires, both commercially and residentially, to understand where attitudes and behaviors were shifting or where priorities were shifting. That begins to help inform reentry beyond just our own perspectives of what's important for reentry. So I think all of the panelists here benefit from having exposure to the various asset classes to help maybe give each one of us that step ahead as we think about the region reopening again.
Thank you for that.
I could jump right in here also and just talk a little bit about our senior living operations, because that really never shut down. We were, among the hardest hit. And really, it was definitely the hardest hit facet of our business. And obviously, we're dealing with elderly people. It's a very sensitive population, but we had 5,000 elderly residents quarantined in our buildings. And at a point in time, up to 200 employees calling out sick per day. So that posed a lot of operational challenges, right? All of a sudden, we had to deliver food service 3 times a day to residents' rooms, no visitors, couldn't take any new residents. And frankly, we had a very fearful staff, which is a difficult thing to manage. Lots of added expenses for overtime, healthcare benefits, testing, PPE, all that kind of stuff. Actually saw a report recently that the National Center for Assisted Living is estimating that's a $5 billion expense industry-wide, to give you an idea of the scope. So we had to do a lot of sort of quick pivots, and at the same time follow a lot of guidelines coming through CDC and New York State, which were changing daily, sometimes hourly. Implement temperature testing and COVID testing. We did a lot of structural upgrades, HVAC filters and heavy cleaning routines and the antimicrobial products. And now we're entering this reopening phase, and we're starting to re-outfit buildings with plexiglass and other things to keep people safe as we start bringing outsiders back into the building. But it was a very difficult time for us in that facet of our business.
Yeah, I can certainly understand that. David, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, from an industrial point of view,
Yeah.
It hasn't been as bad. Again, dealing with some of our tenants who have been hit hard by the financial ramifications of COVID. We have been dealing with those particular companies on an individual basis. Each company is like a snowflake. They all have their different financial backgrounds and financial situations. So we've been dealing with them one by one. Most of them are in a pretty decent stead and will hopefully come out of this okay. So we haven't seen anybody give up their space or wanting to give up their space. And those that are a little bit shaky, we're trying to deal with them as best as we possibly can. On the other hand, some of our, like I said before, that 230,000 square foot building was taken, and we have a lot of activity in companies that are dealing with this last mile, with the Amazons and that particular type of industry, looking at our space, our space, because Long Island in itself is an incredibly large market, and then the proximity to New York City is also big. So they need a lot of warehouse space for the product and to deliver it as rapidly as possible. So, and from a construction standpoint, we've been continuing. So we've been, and we never stopped. So we had to adapt as best as we possibly could on the fly. So, you know, temperature taking and try to keep the construction workers 6 feet away from each other as best as we possibly could, and making our sites as safe as possible from the COVID as best as we possibly could. We've done a pretty, I think we've done a very good job, not a pretty good job, but a very good job of doing that. And our properties have been safe and sound, and we've had no issues, or at least none really major, thank God, for both the individuals and the companies and the subcontractors that we deal with. So from a global point of view, or from our residential that we're about to enter, look, we're going to have to get on board with virtual tours until as best as we possibly can, and showing as best as we possibly can for the 5 Points Towers in the city. Whenever we possibly can open up and do that, I think there's nothing better than actually feeling the space that you are going to rent, and that goes not just for residential. I think it goes for commercial and retail as well. People really want to feel the space as best as they possibly can. So I don't know how that's going to be, and I think what's going to happen is, as fast as we can get a true vaccine, and see how that works, I think the faster we are at coming back. And until that point, I don't know really what the world looks like. I think it's kind of in a flux right now, and we're all, as you can hear, we're all kind of trying to figure out what the best way to go about doing that is.
Yeah, and I think that kind of raises a really good point about, we're sort of in an interim phase right now where the immediate impact of COVID is past. And, we're still a ways from a long-term kind of vaccine and return to some new normal. And so right now we're in this interim period where we're really just trying to kind of, make it up as we go along. But I do want to kind of follow up with you and ask all of the panelists, but maybe we'll start with you. In terms of the future of Long Island and what it's going to look like, we've been hearing a lot about this idea of a suburban rush. So people fleeing the denser parts of the city and trying to move out to Long Island where there's more open space, and you don't need to have employees commuting on public transport, mass transit, which can reduce some of the risks. And so I'm curious for all the panelists to hear your thoughts on this possible kind of flight to suburbia and, you know, how that would impact the different asset classes and types of real estate on Long Island. And I do know from previous discussions that we have some very different views on the panel. So I'm really, you know, kind of interested to hear from all of you and have you talk about it with each other a bit. So David, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so obviously I'm pretty long Long Island real estate right now. So I've got to, you know, most of us on this panel, and I would probably all of us are, you know, developers, you got to be cockeyed optimists anyway. I mean, no matter what happens to you, like, it's going to be great, you know, so it's going to be great. No, it's as best as we possibly can make it. And we haven't deviated from our plan. So we believe that, well, by the time we probably get going with, let's call it Heartland Town Square, because that's really our big project in the future out here. By the time we get up, we believe that the vaccine will have happened, and we're in a safer environment. So we believe as human beings that we're going to be back to gathering together and being around one another, shoulder to shoulder, face to face. So we haven't backed off on any of our, you know, Heartland Town Square is a highly amenitized property. Like I said, it's that play. And most millennials and Gen Zers really want, at least we believe that they still do want that sort of a highly amenitized product. And going forward, so we haven't backed off on any of our plans. As far as the current state of Long Island and what's happening, look, after 2001, after September 11th, there was that kind of snap where everybody believed they had to rush to the suburbs to have back office space. And, you know, everybody was scrambling, oh, David, you're going to be in such a good position. You're in Long Island. And when I say good position, they weren't happy for me and happy about the situation. It was just you know, so take that for what it is. But like, you're in a good position to get these companies. I didn't see any of it. So as much as they were talking about it, and really, I'm sure there's a lot of activity and people, and I know I have friends of mine who live in the city and who are now out here in Long Island. And I was just told by one of my friends that the private school out in East Hampton, the Ross School, is up 20% in enrollment for next year. And the Sag Harbor School District is up 30% in enrollment. So, you know, there is something to be said that people are rushing a little bit to suburbia, or at least in that particular class of people. I truly believe that it's kind of an overreaction. I think as businesses and as people, we overreact to the situation at hand, but I think it's going to normalize once the vaccine happens.
Thank you.
I would say that I don't disagree with anything David said, and you know, I think that it's interesting that there's, to his last point about the Ross School, some of this may be driven by not businesses but individual desire, right? So if people really say, well, I really just, you know, after this, that big city attraction, you know, the mass transit thing doesn't work for me. But I think in some cases it's a little too early to tell. And to the point about therapeutics and a vaccine, if we get those things and we're successful and there's a lot of traction on that we will, people may have a very short memory, you know, a year from now regarding density and, you know, being concerned about mass transit and urban densification. Because again, you know, the draw of a big city, whether it's New York or any of the other big cities, that you know, especially for the younger generation, that feeling of excitement, that collaboration, a company's access to talent and where talent lives, I think that we think those things will come back. Long Island's always been a good market for office. It's about, you know, 42 million square feet of Class A, Class B office. At the end of the first quarter, it was doing very well, you know, in terms of its occupancy rates. And I think that we're seeing certainly in our portfolio that the Long Island tenants, office tenants, have been fairly robust and healthy through this crisis. Everybody has their challenges, but we've been very, very pleased with the performance of our tenants during this issue. And I think we're certainly seeing that some of the larger tenants in our portfolio in the city, they are starting to do their demographic studies of the suburban areas. Where do their folks live? How far are they commuting? There's calls going on in the brokerage community about short-term space, maybe to de-densify, at least right now in this period. But I think David's absolutely right. I think when we get to the point where we're past this, really past it, hopefully, I think that the draw of the big cities in that urban environment and that proximity to a 24/7 retail experience will come back. And that also presents an opportunity for us as developers to bring some of that vitality and that affordability and that density to suburban developments like the Hub or Garvey's, and to expand on that in a market that has such close proximity to a major urban center.
Yes, definitely.
I actually, I agree with both of the previous panelists and what they said, but I think I have a little more of a pessimistic view on the timeline. And I agree that everything's going to be kind of wonky until we have some sort of a vaccine or the virus goes away. And then, but I also think we're going to move into a bit of a recession, and the question is for how long. So for me, this is a 3, 4, 5 year crisis. I don't see people fleeing back to the city all that quickly. And I have a little bit of a pessimistic outlook on the next number of years for the city. I think that we will see this flight to suburbia. I think this phenomenon is kind of real. Time will tell, obviously. But I'm reading a lot of brokerage reports. Inquiries are way, way up. People have reached out to me personally. I think people who are young families who are considering this already, this is a catalyst for it. I think people are considering a new lifestyle. I think we're going to see a ton of single family home transactions in the coming year or so. And we've been experiencing this sort of 20-year trend on Long Island in multifamily housing where it's been mostly senior, 55 and older condos. But not everything can be senior, right? So I think that Long Island is starting to realize that other types of housing are necessary. We're seeing a lot of uptick in rental housing. And I think that the notion that more density on Long Island is needed is starting to become understood by the community. Again, we're building 800 rentals. We're starting to market those short-term in Manhattan and the boroughs. We're marketing furnished options, and we're seeing inquiries. We're running virtual tours, and we're actually signing leases in the midst of COVID. So I think there's some promise there. And on the senior living side of things, I think that the product type is definitely here to stay. I think there's a temporary kind of blip, maybe a flock to some home health care for a while. But I highly believe in what we do and the need for what we do. And to a certain extent, what we do is become an alternative to a nursing home. And I think post-COVID, for a while at least, nursing homes will be somewhat stigmatized. And I think assisted living will become a new norm or a new option for a lot of seniors.
Hey, Scott, I'm curious, what do you feel about what part technology plays in the kind of success of what you just laid out in terms of, even younger people starting a family, wanting to have that suburban lifestyle, and how tied in do you think that'll be to remote work success? Because I think one of the things that's interesting for me to watch and keep an eye on to see if it really has staying power is this notion that companies are making a long-term commitment to work from home strategy, because it'll be interesting to see if this pandemic really swung the needle over to that other direction where it'll have real staying power. Because I know in years past, you had companies like Yahoo, for instance, try to implement a work from home policy, and then it started to really erode the culture, and they kind of shifted back from that, right? So I think everybody's embracing and understanding in this current environment that at least short-term work from home does play a part. And I think we're happy as property owners to see our tenants have this mix of work from home and coming back to kind of ease the burden on the buildings. But whether or not that'll have staying power long-term, and if you as a company can actually perpetuate a culture long-term, I think remains to be seen as to how well that'll be successful. Because to go to suburbia, you need to have the jobs, right?
100%. But I also believe once companies start to make that transition to work from home, when companies say that we are going to stay working from home for the next period of time, whatever it is, multiple years, I think it's kind of hard to go backwards at a point in time. I think that at some point you create certain employee expectations, you create a certain culture. I think that if you're committing to physical space, that's somewhat different and is, expected on people coming in shifts or at different times, or people start to office differently and they think of the office more as a functional place as opposed to a home. Some of these things I think don't go backwards, right? So, and I think a lot of that opens up the door for suburban living, right? You don't have to commute as often, you don't have to commute as much. So I think that a lot of the things that we're seeing, if they do stick, time will tell, may make suburban living an easier phenomenon. You asked about technology. A lot of technological advances we're seeing in the senior space, which are worth noting. And a lot of this was happening sort of pre-COVID. There's a lot of artificial intelligence stuff that we've been implementing. We were putting devices that look kind of like cameras in resident rooms that measure people's movements, can tell you if their movement patterns change, maybe there's an illness, fall detection through these AI devices, and a lot of things, a lot of progressions that are making a lot of strides. We're investing a lot in telehealth. So in our exam rooms in assisted living, re-outfitting them to permit telehealth. That's a huge advancement in the addiction space as well. So a lot of these sort of virtual technologies are really coming to fruition through this COVID thing, and people are really starting to invest in them.
Agreed. I think your point about telehealth and you know, telemedicine is spot on, and I think that's a huge area for growth for all the hospitals, and quite frankly, probably somewhere where the U.S. is behind. And you know, if Dr. Fauci even pointed out that the pandemic is really shining a light on areas in the healthcare industry where substantial improvement can be made, and I think we're kind of being dragged into that really quick.
I would agree.
David and Whitney, do you guys want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think as far as our region's health is concerned, I think at the end of the day, there's always elasticity between the suburbs and the city. And if you look at just economic trends and other socioeconomic trends over time, you will see that over the past 100 years, there has been some give and take between both the core urban center and the suburban center, depending on new residential growth or anticipated commercial growth. The end of the day, it's all driven by the health and improvements within mass transportation and the infrastructure. Because I think, to me, one of the most telling things that I eagerly await seeing is if we have gotten the region onto an overall behavioral shift through this current crisis that lasts until there's a vax, we should then see what better individual prophylactic hygienic practices do to the normal cold and flu season. If we learn that that also goes down because of our better hygienic practices, that's a huge correlation to say that if people are just taking better action steps, then other elements of fear factor are dealt with. I'm also shocked when you see people Instagramming and taking photos of how clean the subway system looks or how clean the mass transit system looks. To me, one would say, why isn't it that clean all of the time, right? So I'm hoping that there's certain behavior changes, both at the public sector level and through individual actions, that demonstrate that you can have connectivity between both regions and still be dependent on the efficient mechanisms that we've had for several decades now, if overall everyone's taking the right precautionary steps to protect the overall pleasantry of that experience together. Because then both the city and the suburbs win. I actually think what you're going to see is a trend towards both. I think corporate cultures acknowledge the fact that there is still a sense of belonging that happens when you're still with your colleagues. There's a sense of overall productivity that happens when you're with people together, making things work. The counter to that is people also have expressed that they appreciate when they can get back 3 hours of their day in some cases, an hour of their day in other cases, of not having the commutation time. So I actually think you might see certain large institutions thinking about expanding some suburban presence, not to necessarily detract from the urban presence, but it's giving colleagues a chance to say, it's as long as you are working and working with people, you have flexibility as to where you work. So I wouldn't be surprised if you end up seeing more of a corporate movement that work from home becomes an added benefit that's listed in additional to regular vacation or PTO. You might see an increase in work from home or work from anywhere. That's another trend that's showing a lot. I've read an article on Harvard Business Review that it's not even about work from home anymore, it's work from anywhere. The work from anywhere quotient, I think, is something that you're going to see increased. And I also think there's also benefits to things like parental leave, summer hours for working parents, that actually means you can still be productive and be with your family. So I'm going to ride the line of cautiously positive. I think there's things that benefit both suburban activity and urban activity, depending on how the institutional cultures respond to productivity in group setting versus individual setting. And moreover, just a blanket statement for the region, it's all still dependent on safer, better practices with transportation.
Yeah, yeah. And I think one of the you know, it's not, we don't have to think of it as city versus suburban. There are ways for both to benefit. And also that there's, you know, perhaps a changing model in suburbia itself. So, you know, Long Island has really historically been, you know, it's been very difficult to build multifamily housing on Long Island. As Scott mentioned, a lot of it is in the senior living sector. But with younger people maybe wanting to be out of the city, you know, how might that change? I think we're already seeing an increased demand and response. The developers are responding, and the cities and the zoning boards and the localities are also starting to respond to that. And so, you know, the nature of the suburbs might change from the kind of sprawling Levittown model that we've all kind of grown up with and are used to something very different. And so kind of 2 points on that, you know, one is the, you know, multifamily housing, and then just a more general sense, I think, you know, David and RXR are both working on projects that are smart growth or more of a new urbanist model, which is kind of a denser living within a suburban setting. So maybe we could spend a little time kind of talking about both of those possible kind of modifications of the suburban model.
Yeah, I mean, that's a, you know, as I mentioned before, we're geared towards that point that, again, it's about the vaccine, but more than that, it's an economic situation for most people. You know, the suburban, we believe that it'll be first of all, living on Long Island, being here in Long Island, you're around the best beaches in the world. You're very close to some of the best parks in the world. I mean, it's an amazing place to live, period. And then from a cost standpoint, at least from our point of view, the way we're building it is, again, highly amenitized, which we believe is what Gen Zers and millennials want, as well as empty nesters. They kind of want the same thing, this walkable, bikeable community or communities. And so we're still focused on that, and we believe it, and we can offer it at a price point that's reasonable, especially for those coming out of college and right before they have a family. It's a fun, active lifestyle and affordable. And I don't see, maybe this actually is the impetus that pushes it forward faster, as opposed to everybody, you know, wanting to live in single family homes, which is unsustainable. It was unsustainable for Long Island pre-COVID, and it's unsustainable now, and it's unsustainable in the future. I mean, Long Island has to get away from this sprawl mentality. You know, we have to think differently. And I think, you know, prior to COVID, we were getting, you know, we had a nice little push towards that, and hopefully this pushes us even faster. Again, I'm an optimist, so I believe that we're going to have a vaccine. I believe it's going to be more sooner than 4 or 5 years. I truly believe that. So from a smart growth point of view, you know, we're steady as she goes. We're moving it forward the same way we were before.
Yeah.
No, I completely agree. And I think that, you know, what we've seen with, you know, public-private partnerships and the project that we have at the Hub, that's very exciting. We've seen that kind of shift in mentality, especially from municipalities, about recognizing that we need to have, it certainly has to be responsible development, but it has to embrace that kind of what we call the work, play, live, stay model, where you provide a solution for particularly the younger generation to find a way to afford to live on Long Island, right? Where these are not new sound bites from years ago about how our kids were graduating college and could not afford to come back and live on Long Island. And that's not the position we want to be for, as David puts it, you know, one of the most fabulous communities and regions in the entire United States, right? And so responsible development that provides solutions for people to not only live, but be in close proximity to a place where they can have a career is incredibly important, and certainly what we're focused on.
I'll jump in and just say that I completely agree that this is what we need. And I actually think that RXR and Davis Group are both somewhat ahead of their time, because Long Island historically hasn't been receptive to these types of developments. And the question for me is, will this actually change anything? And we are starting to see some modest changes, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the big question for me is, will this change the municipal process on Long Island? And really the question is, how bad will the fiscal situation be? Because the reports I'm seeing is Long Island could lose billions between tax revenue and other revenue. They each got $250 million in STIM money, and probably more to come. But historically, money, taxes, permit fees, et cetera, haven't been a driver of development. And maybe this is different this time. That said, we are seeing some modernization in the local towns. They're allowing electronic submissions. They never did that before. We're seeing virtual meetings in towns and IDAs. That's something that probably should have happened sooner. We're even hearing a lot of positive talk around self-certification, which doesn't sound like a big thing, but to developers, it's a very big thing. If you can hire a third party to review your plans on behalf of municipalities or Department of Health, that's tremendous. So we are starting to see some little stuff happen. I've just been doing this out here for 20 plus years, and got my head kicked in enough to know that Long Island's a tough place to change.
Scott, I think you're hitting on something else too that's important. We've been talking about it quite a bit, and we actually had a conversation internally about it this morning, and that's government intervention and kind of the unprecedented stimulus that we've had in this environment. And it's important. Somebody said this morning too, if there's kind of a resurgence of the virus and this comeback is a little bit of a head fake, as it was put, and that we need to scale back again. Congress can't, importantly, take its foot off the gas in terms of what it's done to try to prop up business at this time. And certain aspects of it certainly have been more successful than others. But I think seeing, in the next phases of that, how that can drill down into the state and local governments is going to be super important to your point in this lost revenue. I think that needs to be addressed long-term, as well as just trying to make sure that small businesses and other businesses can function as well. So the government, again, has to play a big role in this.
Yeah, and perhaps, giving some aid to state and local governments to kind of help with these projects and help with, staying on course.
Sure, if you think about it, if they don't find a way to do that, and the state governments have to figure out how they're going to pay for all the bills for everything that they've been just hemorrhaging money for, the next step is, we're going to have to lay off teachers and police and fire persons, and none of that makes any sense, right? So I think that government, really has to stay focused on continuing to step up.
Yeah. And in terms of trends, I think one of the things that Scott was hitting on, and David as well, there was a trend on Long Island even before COVID to start, thinking more about smart growth and a different type of development. And there was some movement in that front. And, it's possible that this is going to accelerate that, which had already started. Another one of the trends that I think we've seen, not just in Long Island, but nationally, is, a difficulty or a trend away from retail, and retail struggling in this, online era where there are Amazons and other types of alternatives to retail shopping. So maybe, Whitney, I know this is your area of expertise, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about what was retail like on Long Island before this even happened, and how do you see it changing or accelerating because of the current crisis or new scenario?
I think yep. So Scott Reckler, our CEO, is also featured on Tuesday on Fox Business News, actually discussing, some of the issues that Main Street's facing, so to speak. So, to echo those sentiments, I think I'm going to take more of a general position on retail, period. Some of the fissures that were hitting retail that became much more prominent fractures was really the notion of too much monotony. Some of that could be tied to over aggressive growth, depending on who the retailer is. Some of it could just be tied to operational practices. But the retailers that really began to think more about creating digital solutions that marry the point of sale experience to the efficiencies of ordering and having, home delivery or online efficiency. And the ones who also really thought about overall store count consolidation to making the strong performing stores an overall better qualified and quality experience for the customers going in are likely the ones who are going to weather the impact of COVID and a mandated shutdown. there were already retailers poised for demise coming into this because they weren't responding to behavioral trends or thinking about best performance per square foot out of a smaller store count or a more experiential store count. And, you know, for those who were behind the eight ball, they're likely going to continue to struggle or might be forced into a more dire economic situation. So I think retail is really bifurcated. You're going to have strong performers continuing to perform well because they were already either heavily vested into behavioral change or an operational change, or we're beginning to think about that, and this just accelerated or catalyzed that commitment. I think clearly for our region, more so than some of the big boxes and large malls, who candidly have other layers of defense from an economic recovery standpoint, baked into other structures, insurance policies, or what have you. The mom and pops, the small restaurants, the small business owned retail is really the group that is suffering and is going to likely suffer, far beyond the ripple effect. I think is far beyond just the next 3 or 4 months. That's the group that I think it's just important that again, just echoing what our other panelists have said about, the government just can't take the foot off the gas. We really have to be thoughtfully considerate about how those groups are able to get the lights back on, or given the right resources, both economically and whether it's legal or fiscally speaking, to help them figure those solutions out, knowing that they may not have the everyday access to the best attorneys or the best insurance adjusters or whatever that is to help them move the process along. Because our region, Long Island in particular, has a healthy makeup of both, right? It's big, massive institutional ownership married to everyday single owner. And that's actually part of the beauty of our diverse region and our diverse communities. So it's really, really critical. That also has an entire impact thereafter. It's about employment. It's about job creation and training, especially when you think about food and beverage providers. It allows for part-time and full-time employment. It supports people who have come into this country for the first time, helping them get a job and make things, connect so that they can actually plant seeds and build families. So the mom and pop solution is just a critical issue right now. And we just hope that we can get these groups access to funds as quickly as possible.
Thank you.
And
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, echoing what Whitney's saying, is it's a tale of two different types of retail. It's also a tale of two different times for those mom and pops. It's the immediate concern, and then it's long-term, how successful we are as developers, master developers, and as communities in rebuilding our communities, because those smaller retails will always be able to compete with, the giants and the Amazons and the digital platforms of the world. Because if we want to create those walkable communities, we need experiential retail. You can't create that online. And so there may be, a tale of, 2 days here. Today will look very different than a few years from now, but I think there'll always be a place for that certain market segment to create that opportunity for people who are living and working in these areas to enjoy that type of retail environment.
I'll just jump in and add that I'm eyeing retail for redevelopment opportunities, because we're seeing many large retailers filing for bankruptcy. 40% of the nationals didn't pay their May rent. So I think there's clearly going to be some opportunities to scrape some big box and develop in its place going forward. There was a lot of redevelopment going on. Actually, most development on Long Island was redevelopment pre-COVID, because we don't have much land left, right? So we were buying up schools and industrial uses and ancillary parking and even some landscaping yards. And I think the next hurrah for us as Long Island developers could be some of these retail sites that go defunct.
Yeah, tired malls, especially tired malls or larger shopping centers, because you already have, you've scale, right? Scale of property is critical. You can clearly, maximize abundant parking needs just based on what was already in place or abilities to develop up or below ground to or potentially Texas Rapid or whatever to hide it if you don't want it to be an eyesore. And then you can have kind of a celebrated mixed use environment. So I think that's an area to watch. Tired malls might feel the distress on every possible level, which means there could be owner developer relief required, which could come into the form of an opportunistic developer going in and really converting that into something that's very engaging in the spirit of integrated mixed use.
David, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I agree with all of it. I agree with all of it. I think that the gray properties that they're talking about need to be redeveloped if they're dying. Certainly Long Island needs it, right? I mean, I have 9,000 housing units, 3 million square feet of office, 1 million square feet of retail. Again, that might scale back. The retail portion might scale back a little bit. But as Frank said, I still need the guy who you can have your shoes fixed by,
Right.
the small store to get your food from, and as well as big supermarkets. And all the other little stores that are really make the experience a pleasant one, and one that you want to keep living in this environment with. But certainly Long Island, as big as my project is, as big as RXR's projects are, there's still room for a whole lot more needed. Probably so if Scott is buying up these particular malls that have gone bad or will be going bad, and converting them into these smart growth properties, we're at 17. The metropolitan area, the rental housing stock is at 17% compared to the rest of the metropolitan area. In Long Island, 17%. In the rest of the metropolitan area, it's about 35%. So we've got tremendous amounts of needs, a need for rental stock, housing. So I agree with all of it. It's needed. It's necessary. We need to have a shift in the way we go about developing here in Long Island for all those reasons. We need self-certs. Everything needs to change, basically. And we're in a period of time where it might accelerate.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things that it sort of occurs to me is the shift to malls and kind of the strip malls, and that was spurred by suburbanization and by sprawl, where you were no longer able to walk to the corner market, get a cup of coffee, take your dry cleaning, and so people had to get into their cars, and then it was easier to just go to the mall or the Walmart or whatever it was, where you could do everything at once. And if we do begin to develop more densely within suburban areas and create smart growth and communities that have a lot of their own amenities, and as you said, a few different restaurants and some opportunities for, retail and entertainment and things like that, then, as we change the nature of the suburbs, all of those kind of ancillary land uses are going to change with it.
Absolutely.
Agreed.
So, okay, so maybe now we could just talk a little bit about, also I want to encourage audience members or participants, if you have some questions and you'd like to submit them through the chat box, I will, do my best. One of the things that you guys had mentioned, well, I guess maybe we'll start with a retrospective, which was that, this isn't the first major kind of transformative crisis we've been through. Just in the last, maybe 20 years, we've been through September 11th and the changes that were brought by September 11th, and then 2007 to 2009, the financial crisis and the recession. How do you think this current crisis compares to those, and what lessons can we learn from them kind of going forward?
Sure. If you want, I'll start, and I had shared my thoughts with the group earlier. I think when you think about 9/11 and then you think about the 2008 Great Recession, I think that this is different from both of those, right? I think from the standpoint of change after 9/11, a big push that we saw towards increased security, physical infrastructure upgrades, think turnstiles, think the way that a modern office building is now developed and built in Manhattan. We've seen massive developments in Manhattan since then, and a complete change to the philosophy in the building code related to those, and those types of things have stuck. I think similarly, we're going to see, to Whitney's point, the subway should always be clean, right? And the things that we've done in our office buildings to make them safer, a lot of those things I think are just good practice in general. And we're looking forward to seeing those persist over time, even if we do get to a vaccine solution or better therapeutics that make the virus less deadly. And so I think in comparison to 9/11, that's really the appropriate comparison to see what sticks in terms of what we've changed. And in terms of the Great Recession, I think what's different, and I mentioned to the smaller group earlier, was I think that there was some systemic problems, right? The housing market, other factors that once that started to go bad, There were really some systemic things about the economy beneath that were just really making it very difficult to address in any quick manner some type of an economic recovery, right? And we saw that, in some cases, it was like the lost decade in terms of how long it took to come back. Here, we have a little bit of a different situation in that the shutdown, the slowdown, the loss of revenue is all self-imposed and super critical, right? We all know we had to do this contraction. It made sense to do this contraction to slow the spread and not overwhelm our hospitals in order to be able to handle the disease. But there's an underlying thinking, and the stock market's an indicator, but the stock market is not the economy, right? So we shouldn't be distracted by this recent explosive growth related to the new jobs numbers to think that that represents the economy. But I think that it does represent the fact that there was a lot of health in the economy. Put aside the political unrest that we had before and that we have now, we had record job employment, the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years, consumer spending at all-time highs, that economic expansion that we've been living with 126 months long, the longest on record. And all those fundamentals are still there. What will remain to be seen now is as we open up, how quickly we can continue to get those jobs back. Does that good news in May persist, or do we have a little bit of, I think there's some sentiment that we might see another bit of downturn in jobs there, but a lot of that will be how comfortable are people with coming back? How comfortable are people going back to malls? 80% of the malls in the country are open again at this point. And so it'll be interesting to see if we can maintain, keeping the virus at bay and doing a good job with that and not seeing spikes in these curves that we've all worked so hard to bring down. Maybe the economy can be recovering quicker. Everybody talks about a sharp V as opposed to an extended U. I think we're probably somewhere in the middle. It's a lot of guesswork right now. But again, I think those underlying fundamentals about a healthy economy that were there will help us, provided we don't go backwards again with the virus. It's my personal opinion.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any other views or? So then, in addition to this ties into what you were just saying, but that was the historic perspective. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the economic outlook in each of your different industry sectors and asset classes kind of going forward, and what you see as, what are lenders thinking, what are investors thinking, where's the market going?
From an industrial point of view, we are, again, we're bullish. We're going to continue to build. Like I said, next year we're building another 150,000 square foot building or bigger, right about 150,000, a little more than that. So we're bullish on industrial, at least in our area, in Long Island. We haven't seen any pushback. Again, our tenants are pretty relatively strong. But again, from our perspective, and we're in a good situation for those particular types of properties, we self-finance those particular types of properties, and so we're in a good position that way. But the other guys can talk about and much better about retail and residential. And
I can jump in quickly on senior living, and just to start, I'll say that I'm very confident that senior living does rebound. I believe in what we do. I think there's a lot of benefits with regard to socialization and activity-based programming and the types of care that we can provide versus home health care or other alternatives. That said, I do think there will be a temporary bump in home health care just based on fear of being around people. I think there's long-term psychological effects that go along with this crisis. But at the end of the day, there's 80 million baby boomers coming of age for senior living. We, even during the last construction cycle, which was a big one, couldn't build enough to accommodate that demand. So I think that assisted living, memory care products bounce back rather quickly. Independent living maybe a little less quickly because it's less of a sort of need-driven product. I also think there's going to be a growing affordability component to what we do. Currently, assisted living, 15% of our revenue comes from Medicaid. Nursing homes is about half. So I think there's an affordability component that has to get built into assisted living, because ultimately, I think I mentioned before, we're becoming an alternative to a nursing home. Our average age in our facilities is late 80s, you know, and it's it really becomes sort of an alternative. With regard to what's going on in the market, deals are closing. Larger lenders for larger players are closing deals, slightly modified terms, but there's activity, which is great to see for construction and acquisitions. I think some of the smaller players probably get weeded out. Some of the less successful operators are already starting to file bankruptcies and default. So I think there's going to be sort of a flight to quality like we've seen in previous crises with regard to lenders and equity investors. But I really do believe in what we do. And on the multifamily side of things, I think COVID makes urban living less attractive, short, medium term. We talked about that earlier. So I think people will flock to suburban living. People need a place to live. And as David said, we're undersupplied for multifamily housing in this region, grossly undersupplied. So I think we rethink some of the things we do with regard to common elements and other things, but I think that sector comes back as well.
And I think just to provide our perspective on some of this stuff, and as a private firm, we have investors and partners from all over the world who have always been focused on this region. And I think that, you know, any trepidation that they might have right now, because what we are hearing, they have a lot of dry powder ready to invest. They want to invest. If there's any trepidation about, you know, office, I think it's short term right now to just see how things develop. But there's tremendous activity and interest, again, in our mixed use developments, vertical mixed use, the master planning projects we have, affordable housing, and then certainly to David's point, logistics is a huge area of focus. I don't think that that's going to change, whether there's a flight to suburbia or some mix or combination thereof. Getting that last mile logistics figured out, and you're going to see a big shift away from just the general Northeast region where you had all these major distribution hubs somewhere in like central New Jersey. I think finding these nodes in Long Island City, out in Suffolk County, all these places for that last mile logistics distribution is going to be super important, and there's a lot of opportunity for success there. And then again, on the lending front, I totally agree with Scott's comments. Lenders are working with sophisticated parties. We have deals that are getting done, refinances that are getting done. You know, tenant leases getting signed, right? So sophisticated tenants out there. We've had some very large deals get done amidst the COVID crisis. Some of them were admittedly in the works beforehand and they had a little bit of a pause, but then the companies had some visibility and they moved forward. And we've had some new transactions and we have some leases that are out for signature now that were incubated during the crisis. So a lot of good traction and activity there, in particular on Long Island as well.
Yeah.
Kind of our outlook.
So I think we're getting close on time, and I want to invite each of you to share any kind of closing thoughts. And one of the topics that I wish we had more time to get to, but maybe we can just address it really quickly, is for my students, my law students, and our alumni, this entire situation creates a real sense of fear of what is the employment market going to look like, what are their opportunities going to be like, and so not focusing on that specifically, but you are saying that deals are getting done, you are signing new lease agreements, you're following through with tenants. Maybe if you could just talk a little bit about your relationship with attorneys and the kind of work that they're doing for you now, how they're adding value, what are the legal issues that you're dealing with now, and sort of, kind of advice that you have for my students entering this market and some of our recent alumni who are looking for jobs and looking of, ways to add value.
Sure. If you guys want me to start.
Sure.
I can tell you that all of us, I would speak for everybody, that our attorneys, our outside counsel are invaluable to our business, whether it's a contract for sale, a lender refinancing, new debt, a lease transaction. Our partnerships with the law firms that we work with are longstanding, robust, with some of the best law firms in the country. And day in and day out, we're doing hundreds of transactions per year for millions of square feet, and they're kind of the front lines on the negotiation of those documents and helping us bring them across the finish line with our in-house counsel and our leasing team, who is absolutely critical to the effort as well. How have things been different recently? Obviously with COVID and we have a very stable portfolio and work really hard to make sure that we're doing deals with quality tenants. But in this environment, even quality tenants can suffer. And we've had some very interesting issues that we had, whether it was a tenant who would be struggling to pay rent, where they wanted to access their security. Typically, the way that you would access a tenant's security if they were in trouble was you'd be defaulting them, and then going through a process before you could access their security. We've been working in a much more cooperative manner with tenants who needed to access their security, and that requires an agreement. Our attorneys have been vital in helping us craft those agreements, negotiating them, figuring out what's important and what concerns tenants have in that environment, and how can we put them at ease and get those transactions done. And the law firms have been critical to that. We did have a few tenants that felt that they didn't, and your law students will find this interesting, that they didn't have to pay rent under some legal considerations like impossibility or force majeure clauses. And I can tell you that most commercial leases, they're not written that way. So unless it's a force majeure issue that was specifically contemplated in the lease, it doesn't allow the tenants to abate their rent. And so we've had to have some conversations there, but thankfully those were minor in our portfolio at least. But again, the law firms are playing a critical role there. And now moving forward, they've also been very helpful in terms of what can we do to make our buildings safer, and the types of things that we've implemented, whether it's health screenings. We developed our RX Well program, which has, amongst other things, an app where tenants can download it and they can have their employees answer some pre-screening questions in the morning before they even come to the building. Then we're taking your temperature. We were very early on out in front of those things, made significant investments in the property to do those things. The law firms are critical in determining what can you do, what can't you do, what can you do under a pandemic that the EEOC says is good practice right now, so you can do those things. And again, they're legal considerations. We're all running a business, but we're moving forward with these things from the standpoint of how can we make our occupants and our visitors as safe as possible. And the legal analysis of that is a necessary step to make sure that we don't run afoul of the law as we try to make people as safe as possible. And the law firms have been fantastic in responding and helping us to get that done. So it's an interesting time. And as it relates to graduating and looking for a job, and I reached out to some of our counsel to get their opinion. And I think the general consensus was, if you were graduating now, you were probably working with a firm where they had already made a commitment to you. And a lot of the firms and the peers that he spoke to, they want to honor those commitments. They see that as a long-term investment in talent. It may be harder, a year from now as firms try to figure out what their businesses look like. But I think those people that are graduating now, hopefully they have commitments that are being maintained. And then the difficult thing would be for a young lawyer in particular is that mentoring process in a new firm. And if they want them to have this combination of working in the office and working from home, how do they strike that balance of keeping people safe, keeping the load out of the buildings, but then giving these people that critical mentoring they need at such a critical time in their journey as attorneys. So interesting to see how that'll develop.
Yeah. Anyone want to make kind of a final comment on that?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, ladies first.
I would just add to that, the more that technology in various capacities are integrated into property practices, and that's across any asset class, the more that intellectual property law and privacy policy law is going to become integral to how these things are successfully implemented and effective. Additionally, the more that environmental legislature protects the importance of environmental impact and safety, the more that those legal considerations have to be thought about in things that take the pressure off the owner developer and make sure that the tenants occupants are doing their part as well. And then lastly, when you're dealing with a health crisis, the more that the public sector steps in to say, here are things that just have to be dealt with, I think we're going to start to see new legal language inserted into various agreements that speak to that type of situation as well.
Yeah. And Scott?
So I would actually argue that the legal relationships are even more important in a time like this. People tend to get very litigious when we're in these types of crises. We also value all of our legal relationships. We have an in-house legal team, and we're leaning on them to help us through dealing with insurance carriers. There was a concern in my industry that we could have class action lawsuits. Thankfully, government stepped in to kind of quell some of that issue. But we greatly value the relationships, and I think they will be more important over the next couple of years. With regard to advice for students, my advice really is to be patient. Markets are cyclical, job markets are cyclical too. As Whitney spoke about in her introduction, people change careers multiple times. So I would say if you don't have a job and you're graduating, you might want to try something on for size. It may not be the chosen path, but just kind of getting out there is important. We had an internship program that I implemented a couple of years ago. We had to unfortunately cancel it for this summer. It was a hard decision. One of the things we're doing is we're offering a fall program. So, you know, things that might get you in the door, even if they're not ideal, might be a great avenue to launch your career.
Yeah, and actually I had some students that participated in your internship program, so I know how good it is, and it is a wonderful opportunity. David, you want to make any concluding remarks?
Concluding remarks? Well, based on everybody said really nice things about legal aspects.
Lawyers.
But for lawyers. But what I would say though is if you're graduating and you're young, do yourself a favor, listen first. I know you're very smart. All of you are very smart out there, incredibly smart. But come in and listen first. Use a common sense approach to your business, whether that's in legal or if you end up on our side of the equation. Really use a commonsensical approach. I mean, you know, don't overthink things. Be smart in the sense that using, you know, you're there. You guys are really smart. So use your brains. But listen, people have, you know, I know, I don't know how old you guys are out there. I really don't. You know, people in grad school can be of any age, but let's assume you guys are relatively young. You know, you really want to get a lot of, you know, you look at us as you know, you want to push us aside and get right to it. We have something to say. And we have a lot of experience, and we're going to try to tell you things to avoid, and make your lives a little bit easier. You know, life is as hard as it is, especially in these environments, both from a health point of view and a social point of view. It's hard enough as it is. And listen, that doesn't mean you have to take everything we say as the gospel. But listen, and I think you guys will do very well. And a closing remark, I wish you all a lot of luck in your pursuits. For all the professionals out there, good luck, and everybody, please stay healthy, and we'll see you on the other side of this thing.
Yeah, I just want to beep in to say, I think most of my students and the audience is really like aching for your advice and your guidance. Nobody is at all thinking of pushing you aside, and more just really looking for opportunities to learn. Well, that was my segue into saying, I mean, that's really why I thank you all so very much for being here today and to donating your time and your expertise and all of this to be able to give some guidance to my students and to everybody else that's out there that's participating in this. I think there is no substitute for experience, and for people that are on the ground working every day, dealing with these issues. You know, you are the people that we turn to get that guidance and help us, you know, get us on the road. And I'm also happy that I'm happy that lawyers add value to what you're doing, that you see the value every day, and that, you know, it's really a career that can be very meaningful. And, you know, I just think that that's great for my law students to see, and for, the world to kind of appreciate. Lawyers sometimes get a bad rep, but really a good lawyer can help make life so much easier. And I think that that's really critical. So thank you all very, very much. And thank all of our participants for joining us today. This was really an excellent panel, and I look forward to seeing many of you at our next event.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.